在第五课, we're going to learn about how to narrate a sequence of events in order. There are two important grammar points, 语法点, to cover in this chapter. 就 and le. For our purposes in this level, we're not going to use these words in a very complicated way. We're going to use them very straightforwardly in a couple patterns. However, if you're interested in knowing the detailed grammar behind 就 and le, I'm going to explain it in this video. So this is going to be a lengthy video. Please listen on. So 就 is one of the most critical yet complicated structures in Chinese. There are many ways you can translate 就. For our purposes in this lesson, we're going to translate 就 as then, or maybe as soon as. In this specific situation, 就 is connecting one action to another action. How? Today, we're going to talk about a so-called time connection. So the first action happens, and then as soon as the first action happens, the second action happens. First action, then second action. This is not the only way to use 就, but it's the way that we're going to talk about it in this chapter today. Let's look at an example. 他今天早上起床以后就听中文录音了. Today, in the morning when he gets up, or after he gets up, right after he gets up, then 就, as soon as that happens, 就听中文录音, he listens to a Chinese recording. 王鹏写了信以后就去睡觉了. Wang Peng, right after he wrote a letter, went to sleep. 我做了功课以后就去朋友家玩. After I do my homework, then as soon as that happens, I'm going to go to my friend's house to play. Now, if you notice, every single one of these lines, sentences, follows a certain pattern. And it's a pattern we talked briefly about in the last chapter, which is verb plus le plus object plus 以后 plus 就 plus verb plus object plus le. Now, 以后means after. And in Chinese, remember that it's event plus 以后. So after the event, then something. So this is the first action here, then 以后, then second action. And the connection is that the first action happens, and then right away the second action happens. 他起了床以后就洗澡. Right after she gets out of bed, then she takes a shower. The 以后 here is somewhat implied, but usually it is. So you can omit it if the context is clear, but usually it's in this sentence, in this pattern. There's also another element of this pattern, which is la, which brings us to our second grammar point. What is la? 什么是la? Well, like 就, la is a very complicated particle. It is used in many different contexts for many purposes. For our purposes, there are two new ways that we're going to talk about la today. So the first is something called a new situation la. What does this mean? This la is different from the la we learned before. If I say something like 我做了功课, I did my homework, that is referring to a completed action, right? So it's not a tense, it's not a past tense, it's an aspect saying I have completed doing homework. That's 做了功课. Now this law is something different. This law actually comes always at the end of a sentence, and it describes a new situation. Let's go back and look at our example here. Verb la object 以后就 verb object la. This law is the law we've learned before about completion. 他起了床 He got out of bed. Or she got out of bed. After she got out of bed, then she took a shower. He took a shower. La. This la is the so-called sentence final law, the law 2, the law that describes a so-called change of state, a change of status. That is different from saying something is done or completed. It's actually, what it actually means is that something has changed. So in this sentence, this law actually doesn't exist because right now here, this person is describing a habitual action, something that happens multiple times. So there's no change in status. It also doesn't describe a future status because there has been no change yet. Let's look at an example. 他以前是学生，现在是老师了。She before was a student, but now is a teacher. So this is a new situation, right? This is a new situation that has happened now, a new change of status. You're going to add the sentence final la. This is the la that we see in this so-called verb la object 以后就 verb object la structure. The la is not always present because the person's change of state is not always changing, but if it does change, then you need the la at the end. Let's look at some more examples. 我以前觉得中文很难，后来觉得不难了。So what's the new change of situation? Before she thought Chinese was really hard, now she thinks Chinese is not hard. 不难了. We had a la at the end here. This does not describe that an action has been, there's no action that has been completed, but the person's status is changing. The person's status is changing. Let's go back and look at some examples of the change of status la in the verb la object 以后就 verb object la structure. 昨天我回了家就睡觉了。Yesterday, after I went back home, then I went to sleep. This is a change of status because it happened already, happened yesterday, and it's not necessarily something that happened, it's not a habitual action, right? It's something that clearly happens at a specific time yesterday. This sentence has no sentence final law because it takes place tomorrow. 明天我回了家就睡觉. It hasn't happened yet, so there's no change of state. 回了家 has happened because it is saying tomorrow, after I will have gone home, then I'll sleep. That is the use of the so-called second law, the sentence final law. There is also another use of law that we're going to talk about today, which is law in a series of not just two events, but a series, a narrative of events. Because law is different from the past tense, right? In English, we have to conjugate every single verb in the past tense if we're talking in the past tense. Law is not like that because Chinese does not have past tense. Chinese has something called an aspect, meaning you can talk about completed and uncompleted actions. So you talk about completed actions using le. But if it's a series of events, we don't need every single verb to have a le. Because it's in context, we can figure out that the whole series of actions has already been completed. We don't need a le to describe all of it. Le usually appears at the end of the series once. Let's look at an example. 昨天第一节课是中文。Yesterday the first class was Chinese. 老师教我们发音. The teacher taught us. Well, this is taught here, right? This translate this as taught, even there's no le. Why? Because we know it's happening yesterday. The context is already clear. This is happening yesterday. 昨天第一节课是中文。老师教我们发音、生词和语法，也教我们写字，也教我们写字。So the teacher taught us pronunciation, vocabulary, and grammar, and she also taught us to write characters. And this whole series of events here, there's no le. Then, at the very end, 还给了我们一篇新课文, and she also gave us a new lesson text. Finally, there is a le here. This is a le 1. This is a so-called a le to describe completion that follows a verb. And then that one le is enough to describe this entire action. In fact, in many cases in Chinese, you can just not even use that le at all. You can omit that le even, and there would be no le in the narrative at all. And once again, this is because in Chinese, context is key. If there's a clear context, you can omit many things because they're not necessary. They're already known to both speakers. We know that this is happening in the past because of 昨天. So we don't need to use le all the time. It just sounds very repetitive and unnecessary. So if you're, this is something, all the things that we've talked about today with the jiu and the new status, change of state law, and the law used at the end of a narrative. All these things are fairly high level concepts. What I'd like you to do is just to understand them at a basic level. When you read about them, say, oh yeah, that makes sense. But eventually, if you can start to use these and incorporate these kinds of new structures, and to understand that, oh, in a narrative, we don't need to use le too many times. We can only use it, we use it at certain strategic points. If you can do that in your writing or your speaking, then you've reached a high level of Chinese. All right, thanks for listening to this pretty long video. I hope that was helpful. 谢谢大家，谢谢你的，感谢你们的收听。